Tradition tells us a story of Empress Lizhu, wife to the mythical Yellow Emperor of China, around 5,000 years ago. According to legend, she was drinking tea in her garden when a moth's cocoon fell into her cup. As she pulled it from the warm liquid, she noticed long, fine fibers beginning to unravel. Fascinated, she wove them into a cloth. From that simple moment, an industry was born, one that would go on to shape global trade and human history. Whether or not the story is true is still debated. What we do know is that for thousands of years, the methods of producing silk were a closely guarded secret kept within China. Eventually, that secret spread, and today we know exactly where silk comes from. And the source is surprising. It is from a caterpillar, the silkworm. The story of silk is remarkable because it sits at the intersection of biology, domestication, and human history. So let's take a closer look at the silkworm and explore how its evolution has become inseparable from our own. First, we need to clarify some terminology. Silkworm and silk moth are often used interchangeably, but they don't mean the same thing. Silkworm refers specifically to the larval caterpillar stage of the life cycle. The adult form is a silk moth, and that term can also refer to the species as a whole. Silk moths belong to the family Bombicidae, somewhat confusingly known as the silkworm moths. This is a large group, all known for producing silk during their larval stage. However, most species are not suitable for commercial silk production. So let's narrow our focus to a single genus, Bombyx. This is a small group with only around 8 recognized species found across eastern and southern Asia. Of these, only 2 are central to our story. Bombyx mandarina, the wild silk moth, and Bombyx mori, the domestic silk moth. The origin of the domestic species is still debated. Some researchers have argued that domestic silk moths diverged from their wild relatives millions of years ago. However, many scientists favour a more recent origin, with domestic silk moths descending directly from wild silk moths domesticated around 5,000 years ago. The reason for this disagreement lies in a process known as artificial selection. If the differences between wild and domestic silk moths accumulated at the same rate as earlier changes, their origins may indeed stretch back millions of years. But when humans consistently breed individuals with desirable traits, evolution can occur much more rapidly than it would in the wild. Over thousands of years, selective breeding can transform a population so dramatically that estimating when that change began becomes surprisingly difficult. Wild silk moths are, as Wikipedia rather bluntly puts it, a fairly ordinary moth. But understanding them is important, because it highlights just how dramatic domestication has been. They are native to China, Korea, and Japan. It is the caterpillars that produce silk. In the wild silk moths, this silk is relatively coarse and often mottled in shades of brown and green to provide camouflage. Rather than producing one long strand, they spin shorter fibers and weave them together to form the cocoon. Once inside their cocoon, the caterpillar undergoes metamorphosis. After around 10 to 14 days, the adult moth emerges. Like many moth species, females release a powerful sex pheromone to attract mates. Males detect this using their large, feathery antennae, tracking the scent through the air until they locate the female. After mating, adults live only a few days, typically 3 to 5. Their mouthparts are underdeveloped, so they cannot eat during this time. Their sole purpose is reproduction. The female lays her eggs on mulberry trees, which are essential to the species. Silk moth caterpillars feed almost exclusively on mulberry leaves and are well camouflaged against them. With that, the life cycle restarts. Aside from the dependence on mulberry, this life cycle is fairly typical for a moth. Even this specialization isn't absolute. Silk moths can survive on closely related plant species if necessary, though white mulberry, Morus alba, is the preferred food source. It is these moths that were domesticated thousands of years ago. Regardless of whether Empress Lizhu existed, genetic evidence gives us a clear origin. Wild silk moth populations vary across their range. For example, those in China have 56 chromosomes, while populations in Japan only have 54. Using differences like these, along with genetic markers, scientists have traced domesticated silk moths back to inland China. This is one of the more unusual aspects of silk moth domestication. As far as current genetic evidence shows, they were domesticated once in a single primary event in China, and all modern domestic silkworms trace back to that origin. In many other domestic animals, the pattern can be very different and often more complicated. Species were often domesticated independently in multiple regions before those lineages became mixed in the modern era. Cattle, for example, were domesticated at least twice and possibly more in different parts of the world. Over time, selective breeding dramatically reshaped silk moths. Individuals were favoured for silk length, purity, and colour. Today, the differences between domestic and wild individuals are so pronounced that they are considered entirely different species. One of the most striking differences is in the silk itself. Wild silkworms produce shorter, broken strands. In contrast, domestic silkworms spin a single, long, unbroken thread. This single strand of silk can be 900 to 1500 meters long. To put that into perspective, a single cocoon can contain a thread as long as the height of the Empire State Building, or roughly the length of the Golden Gate Bridge. But it is not just the length that is different. The silk has also changed in quality. Domestic silk is usually white or cream, as the insects no longer apply pigmentation to it. The browns and greens in wild silk are important for camouflage, but in a domestic setting, that is no longer required. Domestic silk is also finer, smoother, and more uniform than wild silk, which tends to be coarser and more textured. These differences also affect how the silk is processed. Domestic silk is coated in a protein known as sericin. When soaked in hot water, the sericin softens, causing the cocoon to easily unravel. Wild silk does not behave in this same way, instead needing to be carded and spun, more like wool or cotton, which is a less efficient and much more time-consuming process. But domestication hasn't just altered the silk, it has fundamentally changed the animal. The most significant difference is seen in the adult moths. Domestic silk moths are entirely dependent on humans for survival. The females still produce pheromones, and males can detect them. But there's a problem. They cannot fly. Larger silkworms are perfect for maximizing silk production. They have enlarged silk glands and make bigger cocoons. But the adult's wings and flight muscles have not scaled up accordingly. Essentially, they are now too heavy to fly. Without flight, males cannot locate females on their own. In natural conditions, that means they are unable to reproduce. Domestication didn't just improve silk, it reduced the natural survival abilities of the silk moth. It reduced camouflage, removed the ability to fly, and even prevented natural reproduction. In other words, after thousands of years of domestication, the domestic silk moth has become entirely reliant on us. It is also worth noting that silk isn't unique to silkworms. Many animals produce silk, including spiders and other insects, but most of them are poorly suited to domestication. Spiders, for example, produce remarkable silk, but they are territorial, often cannibalistic, and difficult to raise in large numbers. Silkworms, by contrast, tolerate dense populations, spin predictably, and produce long continuous threads. In other words, silkworms weren't the only animals capable of producing silk, but they were the ones humans could build an industry around. So how is silk actually made? There are two separate processes involved: the biological process, where silkworms produce silk, and the human process, where that raw silk is turned into fabric. Starting with the biology, silkworms produce silk in specialized silk glands. These are heavily modified salivary glands that create two liquid proteins, fibroin and sericin. We've already mentioned sericin because it plays an important role in unraveling domestically produced silk. It acts as a kind of glue, holding the silk fibers together. But the majority of silk, around 75%, is made from the other protein, fibroin. Fibroin forms the core of the silk thread and gives it its strength and structure. Inside the silkworm, these proteins are stored as a highly concentrated liquid known as silk dope. As the silkworm forces the liquid out, it is pulled and stretched through the body. This physical force causes the fibroin proteins to align and harden, a process known as shear-induced crystallization. In simple terms, the act of pulling the silk out of its body turns the liquid proteins into solid fibers. Water is forced out, chemical bonds between proteins are strengthened, and the silk thread takes shape. Sericin behaves slightly differently. It doesn't harden as readily as fibroin, allowing it to remain flexible enough to coat the fibers and bind them together as the cocoon is formed. Now we turn to the human process. Much like farming animals is called agriculture, or farming plants is horticulture, farming silk also has its own name, sericulture. Silkworms are raised in carefully controlled environments and fed vast amounts of mulberry leaves. When the caterpillars are ready, they spin their cocoons, each one containing a single continuous thread. At this point, a decision has to be made. Sericulturists must calculate how many silk moths they need to allow to reproduce in order to create the next generation of silkworms. Those cocoons are set aside. All the rest are boiled or steamed, killing the pupae inside, but also softening the sericin, allowing the silk threads to be unraveled intact. Producing silk kills the insects, not as a byproduct, but as a design feature. This is essential for harvesting high-quality silk, as moths emerging from their cocoons tear the threads, leaving them far harder to use. It's an efficient process, but one that raises ethical questions we'll return to later. The scale of this process is enormous. To produce just 1 kilogram of silk, several thousand silkworms must consume over 100 kilograms of mulberry leaves. A single traditional silk kimono can require the silk from around 5,000 silkworms. Given the effort, the scale, and the cost involved, the obvious question is why? Why did humans invest so much time and labor into silk? And why did it become one of the most valuable materials in history? Archaeological evidence suggests that humans in China were working with silk at least 8,000 years ago. Early silk fibers have been found in Neolithic burial sites, long before written records. Notably, also long before the presumed domestication of silkworms, around 5,000 years ago. How exactly silk was first discovered remains unknown. The story of Empress Laizu is relayed to us by Confucius and other early Chinese writers, but the tale is likely apocryphal, used to ascribe the discovery of silk to the imperial family. The discovery of silk was likely accidental, perhaps through handling of wild cocoons, or through attempts to harvest fibers for ropes or decoration. Whatever its origin, the earliest evidence of woven silk fabric comes from 3600 BCE, found in a cloth used to wrap the body of a child. This date also aligns with the domestication event of silk moths, suggesting that both occurred around the same time. Silk was unlike almost any textile available elsewhere in the ancient world. It was lightweight, strong, breathable, and could be woven into fabrics that seemed almost impossibly smooth and luminous. Silk production became quickly embedded in Chinese society. Sericulture developed alongside agriculture, and silk quickly took on roles beyond clothing. It was used as currency, in luxury paper, and as a marker of social status. For much of ancient Chinese history, silk was not just a luxury, it was the foundation of the economy. For thousands of years, China maintained a near-total monopoly on silk production. The methods of sericulture were treated as state secrets, and revealing them to outsiders was often punishable by death. Foreign traders could buy silk, wear silk, and trade silk, but they had no idea how it was made. Some believed it came from plants. Others imagined it was combined from leaves or harvested from water. In reality, the secret rested with a small, flightless moth and a tightly controlled farming process. As demand for silk grew, so too did the trade that carried it. Over time, silk became one of the most important commodities, moving along what we now call the Silk Road, a vast web of trading routes connecting China with Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. Silk moved west in exchange for horses, precious metals, spices, and ideas. Along with the fabric itself came technologies, religions, and cultural exchange. Few materials have shaped global trade so profoundly. Eventually, the monopoly broke. According to historical accounts, silkworm eggs were smuggled out of China, hidden in hollow canes or walking staffs. This is the earliest known account of industrial espionage. By the 6th century, sericulture had reached the Byzantine Empire, where silk production was established under imperial control. From there, the knowledge spread further west. By the Middle Ages, silk production had taken hold in parts of the Islamic world and southern Europe. Italy, in particular, became a center of silk weaving, with cities like Lucca, Venice, and later Lyon in France, building entire industries around the fabric. By this point, silk was no longer uniquely Chinese, but its origins still shaped how it was produced, traded, and valued. Today, China is still the world's largest producer of silk, generating over half of the world's supply. The second largest supplier, India, only accounts for around 17% of all silk produced worldwide. But despite its thousands of years of history, the process remains fundamentally the same. The insects and the same harvesting techniques are still involved. What began as a tightly guarded secret has become a global industry, but one that still depends entirely on a domesticated animal shaped by thousands of years of human selection. For most of human history, silkworms were valuable for one reason: silk. But in the modern age, this domesticated insect has taken on a very different role. Today, the silkworm is also one of the most important model organisms in biological research. A model organism is a species that scientists can study in order to understand broader biological principles. These species are chosen not because they are special, but because they are useful. They are easy to raise, reproduce quickly, and can be studied under controlled conditions. Domestic silkworms fit that description remarkably well. They have a short life cycle, produce large numbers of offspring, and can be reared in laboratory environments with relative ease. And because they've been domesticated for thousands of years, they tolerate human handling in a way that most insects do not. In 2004, the silk moth became the first butterfly or moth to have its genome fully sequenced. This opened the door to study metamorphosis, development, silk protein production, and immune responses at a genetic level. Because silk moth biology is so well understood, discoveries made in silk moths can often be applied to other insects, including agricultural pests and pollinators. Silkworms are increasingly being used as living biological factories. They are safe to work with, easy to maintain, and a complete understanding of their genome makes them easy to genetically modify to produce medical proteins, vaccines, and enzymes used in scientific research. In some cases, silkworms offer a cheaper and more ethical alternative to using mammals in early stage testing. Silkworms are also studied to better understand silk as a material. Silk has never been just a fabric. Even in ancient China, it was used for far more than clothing, appearing in writing materials, early forms of paper, and medical sutures. Long before people understood the chemistry of silk, they recognized that it was unusually strong, flexible, and compatible with the human body. Those same properties are what make silk valuable today far beyond textiles. Silk proteins are now used in surgical sutures, tissue engineering scaffolds, and experimental drug delivery systems. In this way, an ancient material has quietly become a platform for modern materials science. In some cases, that research has led to unexpectedly futuristic applications. Bioengineers have used silk proteins to build microscopic, self-propelled micro-rockets, biodegradable devices powered by enzymes and designed to deliver drugs directly to specific disease cells or organs in an attempt to combat diseases like cancer. Other experiments explore silk-based materials for lightweight polymers or biodegradable electronics. Thousands of years after its discovery, silk is still revealing new possibilities, not because it changed, but because we are only now beginning to fully understand what it can do. It's worth remembering that the silkworms used in laboratories today are not wild insects. They are the product of thousands of years of domestication, flightless, dependent on humans, shaped to suit our needs. In a sense, silkworms are not just model organisms for studying biology. They are a model for studying domestication itself, how human choices can reshape an animal's body, behavior, and evolutionary future. From ancient trade routes to modern laboratories, the silkworm has followed humanity into every stage of our development. And that long relationship raises an unavoidable question. What does it mean to depend so completely on another species? Earlier, we touched on the fact that producing silk requires killing the silkworms themselves. Now it's time to return to that question. Not to pass judgment, but to understand the trade-offs involved. Silk production is unusual in that the death of the animal is not accidental or incidental. That fact alone can make people uncomfortable. But whether it makes silk unethical is far from a simple question, and one to which there is no right answer. From one perspective, silk production involves the deaths of thousands of insects for a single garment. From another, those insects exist only because humans bred them, raised them, fed them, and protected them. The domestic silkworm, as it exists today, is entirely dependent on humans for survival. Unlike many animals used by humans, silkworms are not captured from the wild, nor do they experience predation, starvation, or exposure. They live short, protected lives shaped entirely by a relationship that has existed for thousands of years. Whether that relationship is ethical depends largely on how one values insect life, intention, and scale, questions that don't have universal answers. In response to ethical concerns, alternatives do exist. One is often called peace silk or ahimsa silk. Ahimsa being a foundational ethical principle in Hinduism and Buddhism, usually translated as non-violence or non-harming. In this approach, silkworms are allowed to emerge from their cocoons before the silk is harvested. This avoids killing the insects, but it comes with trade-offs. As the moth emerges, it breaks the silk filament into short pieces as it tears itself free from the cocoon. The fibers must then be spun rather than reeled, producing fabric that is rougher, less uniform, and far more labor-intensive to make. So while peace silk reduces harm to the insect, it also changes the material itself. It is not simply the same silk made more gently, it is a fundamentally different product. There are also synthetic alternatives. Nylon was one of the first synthetic fibers ever developed, created in the 1930s explicitly as a substitute for silk. It shares some of silk's properties. It is strong and lightweight, but it comes with its own trade-offs. It is derived from fossil fuels, is not biodegradable, and can shed microplastics, growing concerns in the modern world, and ones that silk does not share. Today, polyester is a more common silk alternative, but it carries many of the same drawbacks. More promising alternatives are made from plant fibers, such as rayon or lyocell, which can closely resemble silk while moving away from fossil fuels and remaining biodegradable. Even more recently, scientists have begun producing silk proteins using genetically modified organisms. Bacteria, yeast, and even goats have been modified to produce silk-like materials. Most famously, BioSteel was produced by extracting spider silk proteins from genetically engineered goat's milk. These technologies are extremely promising, but they are still emerging. They are not yet able to produce silk-like fibers at the scale required for widely accessible clothing, and for now remain largely confined to research and high-value medical materials. So the alternatives are out there for anyone wishing to avoid silk, but they are not perfect replacements, and more are still being developed. But that brings us back to the original question. Should we avoid using silk entirely? Ironically, that solution would ultimately doom the domestic silk moth to extinction. After all, they can only reproduce with human intervention in the first place. As with so many ethical questions, there are no easy answers, and no universal correct choice. The legend of Empress Laizu tells of a cocoon falling into a cup of tea and changing history. Whether or not that moment ever happened is almost beside the point. At some stage, thousands of years ago, humans noticed something remarkable hidden inside a moth's cocoon and began a relationship that would shape both species forever. The domestic silkworm is one of the clearest examples of how profoundly domestication can alter an animal. It cannot survive in the wild. It cannot complete its life cycle without us. Yet the reverse is also true in a way. From the Silk Road to modern laboratories, this small insect has left its mark on our civilization, our economies, our technology, and even our understanding of biology. All from a caterpillar feeding on mulberry leaves. Sometimes the animals that change human history are not the largest, the strongest, or the most intelligent. Sometimes they are the ones we overlook entirely. Hidden inside a simple cocoon is a story of evolution, trade, science, and thousands of years of shared history. And that story is still being woven today. I hope you enjoyed this journey into silk moths. If you're interested in the research behind this episode, you can find a document with image credits and sources in the description below. These videos take a great deal of time and research to produce. They will always remain free to watch. But if you would like to support the channel, and gain access to new videos a little earlier, you can find a link to my Patreon below as well. And to everyone who already supports the channel, thank you. Your support genuinely helps make these videos possible. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, and keep learning. There's still so much to discover about the world's rare and remarkable species. And the more we understand, the better our chances of protecting them. Thanks for watching.